early model JK with a 5.3 Gen 5 engine. I don't think we talk enough about this Gen 5 5.3. This engine's really a powerhouse. And this isn't the heaviest JK on the planet, but this little 5.3 really makes it move. I would say the performance is similar to a Gen 4 6.2. Well, somewhere between a 6.2 and a 6.0. It's that good. And more importantly, it has a lot of torque. So if you guys have a heavy JK, or you tow, or you go to high altitude, you got to remember that these engines have higher compression, 11 to 1 and higher. So unlike the last generation of engines that have lower compression, the high performance LS3 was only about 10.8 to 1. So that combined with the fact that we have better cylinder pressure control with continuous variable valve timing, and then of course combustion efficiency with direct injection means these things are like little go-karts. If you have an average JK, you might want to rethink going with a 6.2. Well, I think the 6.2 is an awesome engine. I think the Gen 5 6.2 is a lot of engine and probably more than your JK needs. And I think you'll find this little 5.3 will get the job done. You'll have no problem cruising at 75 miles an hour on the highway. Going up the mountain grades with the 8-speed is a breeze. The 5.3 is more economical in several ways. You can run the lower grade fuel. Obviously the cost is less. But there's not a whole lot of compromise with performance. At this point, I would take an L83 5.3 over the last generation of LS or Hemi for the average JK. And what I mean by that is if you're somebody who just cruises your JK around the country, you put your family in it, you got 35s, you got 37s, you're not racing it, you're not towing a 10,000 pound trailer, this little 5.3 will get the job done, and again at a lower cost. And I think the performance will surprise you. The throttle response on this little 5.3 with the 8-speed is every bit as good, if not better, than the LS and Hemis that I've been driving lately. Now as far as raw horsepower goes, it doesn't have the horsepower of some of these other engines. But just look at this throttle response. That's just touching the throttle. And the 8-speed puts it right into its power band, so it'll wind it up when it needs to, but then it'll bring those R's right down. So most of you know we've jumped into the Gen 5s years ago with both feet. This is where it's going to be at. The LSs are awesome engines, the Hemis are awesome engines, and even the superchargers and turbochargers have their place. But in my opinion, the 5.3 L83 is the best value for dollar engine when it comes to performance and economy. Now the 6.0 engine from the LS series is pretty close in performance, pretty close in price, but its design is also a decade old, and when it comes to emissions and other concerns with the 6.0, you might be better off with the L83. Another part of this L83 is this 8-speed transmission. GM has just got them dialed in, and as a lot of you know with the JLs, the 8-speed makes a big difference in keeping that engine in its power band. So when you combine this smaller displacement engine with more gears, more diverse gearing, well, you end up with an engine that's more responsive. So we have economy, we have value, we have durability. I do believe that these LT engines over the years have evolved into a very reliable engine. In 14, 15, things were a little bit hit and miss, especially with the transmissions. But GM has upgraded the 4-cylinder mode, the AFM. They've upgraded some of the oiling, knock sensors, push rods, and I think this engine will go for the long haul. So we're trying to distill the offerings of these engines to just a handful, because if you think about it, we've been supporting the LS JK, and it's just surprising to me how many people don't know that we've been doing this now for 10 years. But we've supported the 5.3 LSs, the 6.0 LSs, the 6.2 LSs, both the passenger car and the trucks. We've been supporting the Gen 5s. We've been supporting both the LT1s and the truck Gen 5s. And I think in the old days there definitely was a need for that diversity, because if you wanted economy and decent performance at a good price, the Gen 4 5.3 was the way to go. But the Gen 4 5.3 would not perform as well in a heavy JK or at altitude or towing. So then you went up to the 6.0 because it had value in economy and it didn't cost much more than the 5.3. Then of course if you want top of the line performance, you went with the high compression 6.2, and it was kind of the same thing with the Hemis. You could have got the 5.7 non-VVT motor, and the early Hemi transmissions, the 545 RFE, were just terrible. When they went to the WA 580, that was a big improvement. They also went to VVT with the 5.7, but of course a lot of guys went to the 6.1 Hemi and then to the 6.4 Hemi. So there's a lot of choices out there, but what we're going to try to do, these LTs are so versatile and so good, especially with the 8-speed transmission, that we're going to try to distill this down to just a couple of engines. We're going to have the 5.3 Gen 5 LT, we're going to have the 6.2 Gen 5 LT, and right now I got to say that I'm really leaning towards the LT1 over the L86 for a couple of reasons. One, the LT1 has the short intake, so it fits in the JKs better. Stuffing an LED6 in the early JK especially can be tight because the firewall is smaller. The old 60-degree V6, the 3.8, had a pretty narrow pattern, so the firewall or the tunnel was pretty narrow. So when you stuffed a Hemi in there, a lot of guys would bash on the firewall. When we stuck an LT in there, we had to move the engine forward, and that made it tight up front. It made it tight against the firewall. When Jeep went to the Pentastar in 2012, they turned the battery sideways and they opened up the firewall for the double overhead cam V6. And that means that the LED6 fits a lot better. The LED6 and the LED3 have different intakes. You would think they'd have the same intake like the Gen 4 engines, but they don't. The throttle body on the 5.3 is a little bit smaller. The intake's a little bit lower, so it's easier to fit. But when you stuff an LT1 in one of these JKs, it's just small. The intake is low. In fact, even the LT4 isn't that big. So you got a couple of choices. If you do have an LED6, you can get it in your JK. Just know it's going to be tight. Or you can convert it over to an LT1 intake. It doesn't cost that much. In fact, we've converted both LED3s and LED6s to the LT1 intake, and it works just fine. It gives you a lot more room. It looks really cool. When it comes to exhaust manifolds, you can pretty much run any of them. You can run the production LT1 exhaust manifolds. You can run the GM Performance LT1 exhaust manifolds. You can run the truck manifolds from the 6.2 and the 5.3. They all pretty much work. The 8-speed is not much bigger than the 6-speed, so you won't have any issues there. We're actually doing a couple of builds right now with 2 doors and 8 speeds. So to summarize, I feel that the power adders and engine performance improvements the guys are doing to JKs, and now of course the JL and the JT, have some constraints. In the old days, you know, we were throwing in the Hemis, we were throwing in the LSs and supercharging and turbocharging. So you want to make sure whatever you run is going to be a certified configuration. You got to run the same manufacturer engine and transmission. You don't want to do anything hybrid unless it's got an executive order on it. You know, guys, we're going into 2020, and I've been building hot rods since the 1970s. The latest generation of engines are just awesome. I mean, if you look at not only the engines, but the transmissions, it's so far ahead of what it had available to us all those years ago that the performance, I mean, even with this little 5.3 engine, in fact, will outperform most of the engines from the 1980s. V8s in the 1980s were in the 150 to 200 horsepower range. This little 5.3 putting out 355 horsepower, but when you combine it with the torque, this little engine is probably putting out more horsepower than even the highest horsepower Corvettes and Camaros were back in that day. So go with an engine that has technology. Guys call me all the time, and I just had a guy tell me he wanted to put a small block with a carburetor in a JT, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. Not only is it not legal 50 state US EPA, but these later model generations of engines are lighter, much more powerful, much more efficient. Now, I'm not going to say they're more reliable, because a lot of you probably know the old small block Fords and Chevys were very reliable, but we were also getting 13 miles to the gallon. I had a 283 out of a 1967 Chevelle in my Toyota pickup truck for 330,000 miles. That engine literally just wore out, and the vacuum went away and the compression went away, but it never failed. But that little engine could never do what this engine does, and that is move a relatively heavy SUV as efficiently as this L83. So don't go backwards, guys. Don't get a non-VVT motor. Don't get a 4 or 5-speed transmission. In fact, I think the 6-speed is going to be obsolete soon. I think the 10-speed is going to come out. I'm finally seeing the advantages of these high gear transmissions. Not that I didn't see the advantage a while ago, but I think a lot of you know that when Dodge released their 8-speed and GM released the 8L90, that there were some issues. There were a lot of teething issues, and it just made sense to stay with what worked. But now that these transmissions are getting dialed in, we have to take the advantages of what they have to offer. Don't go with a 4-speed, don't go with a 5-speed, don't go with an engine that doesn't have high compression. High compression combined with variable valve timing, and especially if you can add direct injection and continuous variable valve timing, means that you have perfect cylinder control, and I can feel it in this vehicle. When I drive this vehicle, and I get on the throttle, I'm not feeling that transmission downshift. What I'm feeling is the cam phasing and getting that burst of low-end torque. So combining that with the 8-speed transmission, that means I have pulling power all the way through the power band. There's never waiting for that power to come on, or the engine to rev up, or the transmission to downshift. Am I looking forward to the 10-speed? Yes, of course I am, and we're going to be doing some 10-speed swaps. I do feel the heavier your Jeep is, the larger your tires are, the more beneficial the 10-speed will be. So this is all about technology. GM has taken this little small displacement engine, and when I say small displacement, you guys remember back in the day, the 5.7 liter Chevy, the 350, or the 454 Chevy. I've got a 426 Hemi. These were 7-liter plus engines. This engine's only 5.3 liters. That's 326 cubic inches. And this thing is out there performing with the last generation of 6-liter and 6.2 engines, and in a lot of ways outperforming it. This is amazing technology, and I think you need to take advantage of it. So if you do add a V8 to something, and not just a JK, it could be a hot rod, it could be a classic car, a classic truck, or muscle car, take a hard look at these LTs, because what you're getting for the money, in my opinion, is second to none out there. I do believe that this Gen 5 5.3 LT is going to become the standard for our engine conversions because of cost, performance, and economy. It's just going to be really hard to beat with an 8-speed. If you want that extra power, sure, go for the 6.2. If you want more power than that, go for the LT4. If you want more power than that, go for the LT5. I think that the Gen 5 LT 5.3 has bridged the gap across the lower line engine. If you take the LS lineup, for example, and you look at the 5.3 iron engines, the 5.3 all aluminum engines like the LC9 and the LH6, then you look at the 6 liters like the LC8 and the L96, and even if you look at some of the 6.2s like the L9H and the L94, I think you're going to find that this 5.3 covers almost that whole range. Now, I'm not going to say it has the horsepower of the 6.2 because it doesn't, but what it does have is it has a lot of torque, and it will move your JK similar to the 6.2 could in the old days. Remember, if you put a Gen 4 5.3 in a really heavy JK with 40s and you started going to altitude or up mountain grades, it was going to downshift just like your 3.8 or your 3.6. It was going to go from 6th to 5th and sometimes even into 4th. Now this 5.3 downshifts too, but having more gears means it's not as dramatic, and having more torque and having more compression means it's less likely to downshift. So the 5.3 has covered most of the range for guys that just want good, reliable, economical power at a good price. So I want to make one final observation. A lot of guys know that the diesels are very efficient engines, strive to put a diesel in their JK. I've always said that these LTs are halfway to a diesel. They kind of sound like a diesel. They have an internal mechanical fuel pump that builds up to thousands of PSI pressure. They're running high compression. Now, of course, we're running about 11 and 11.5 to 1. We're not running the compression ratios of the diesel. But the bottom line is, it does have a very diesel-like performance. Diesel engines like to run in a specific power band. And if you get a diesel and you put it in its power band and you cruise in that power band, that's when it's most efficient. And that's when you can really see some economies. But one of the issues with the diesel engines over the years is they've been choked down mainly because of exhaust emission. When you look at high compression engines, we have issues like NOx, nitrites of oxygen, which is a really bad gas. When we start adding exhaust gas recirculation systems and exhaust scrubber filters and all this stuff, it really takes away some of the efficiency of the diesel. What the LT has done has mimicked the diesel in a lot of ways with the high compression. In fact, we're going to start this LT right now, this little 5.3, and you will notice that it cranks a little bit longer than a pure gas engine because we got to get fuel from the low pressure pump into the high pressure pump. Then the high pressure pump needs to build that fuel pressure up, and then it's going to inject it directly into the cylinder. So watch this starting sequence. Now let's take off, and I think you're going to see, looks like she's got her ESP turned off. Yes, this vehicle is owned by a lady. So just driving around town with this 8-speed and this 5.3 is pretty amazing. This is just a little bit of throttle. It's got very docile manners, idles just over 500 RPM, but I'm just so amazed at the torque of this engine. And I don't know if you guys can hear it. You obviously can't feel it, but this little 5.3 pulls like it was at least a 5.7 Hemi, if not more. What GM has done is basically move the gas engine into diesel territory by going with this control of cylinder pressure, direct injection, etc.